first round of information for Chiori has been released pretty recently, and I only just now got done with my initial calc, so I wanted to share them. But before we get into the massive details, we need to talk about what Chiori does. Chiori is an elemental skill-focused sub-DPS unit, and she serves pretty much no other role. Her skill works the same as Keqing's and Alhaitham's, including the Geo Infusion with her Ascension 1 passive. However, it also summons a doll that deals elemental skill damage, and it can summon another if another character has used a Geo construct. Her Ascension 4 passive also incentivizes pairing her with a unit that can create a Geo construct, since it grants her a Geo % damage bonus. This is where a lot of her damage comes from, but it also gets increased even more due to her Ascension 1 passive, which allows her to create more dolls that will then do a coordinated attack whenever the active character deals normal attack, charge attack, or plunging attack damage. Then we have her burst, which also deals a lot of damage and is her best way to deal AoE damage, since her skill is single target. However, the scalings on this are kind of low, and it's kind of lackluster, similar to Albedo, as a lot of the time you'll just be better off either not using it or only using it when it's up. It's just another means of dealing damage, and it's not as significant as you would think, so don't worry about building into energy recharge. While she is technically only a sub-DPS character, she can also sort of be used as an on-field DPS due to her Ascension 1 passive granting her Geo Infusion, but this is kind of a meme, and it actually lowers her damage since she's no longer getting access to her doll's coordinated attacks. If you do want to use her as a main DPS, it's instead just better to use Xian Yun, Fiorina, and Bennett, or Will for her C6. Her normal attack damage is just so low, it's not worth it. Speaking of damage, I have found that Chiori has one of the highest damage outputs for a sub-DPS in the entire game. However, it is single target, which really sucks. Her skill's AoE is in between the same AoE as Tignari's Spirit Vine stuff on his charge attack and Baiju's Elemental Burst. It's really small, it's pretty much only single target. The only AoEs she has in her entire kit is her Ascension 1 passive's coordinated attacks, the dash she has on her skill, and her Elemental Burst. What this means is that it makes her best against bosses or small groups. It's also good against waves, and due to the fact that they persist and don't need to be moved, which is very nice. For her weapons, I made most of the assumptions using her signature, but I also tested out Cinnabar Spindle and Harbinger of Dawn in a few situations. Harbinger of Dawn is generally an incredibly safe and strong pick, and will surpass the Cinnabar Spindle since Cinnabar will have a rather awkward time of proccing the passive effect on every hit. Cinnabar will usually be behind by about 10%, which is pretty awful, but I could be slightly wrong on this because the timings for her skill are so weird. There might be situations where she can, there might be some situations where she can't. Depends. But I am pretty confident that it is 10% worse, and I've even tested a situation where I am wrong and it's pretty much just on par. I still have yet to calc most other weapons, but I'll have that updated in the next video on her. In terms of artifacts, at the moment, Golden Troupe is her best set. Most of her damage output source is considered elemental skill damage, and this just increases more and more with Constellations. This should be the go-to at the moment, unless they do something funky with her, like they did with the last beta update for Navia, which ended up making Nighttime Whispers always surpass Golden Troupe. Since this makes her burst much more lackluster, it also means you don't need to consider building into energy recharge, and you can focus more on damage. Husk is also a good option, but it just doesn't do as well as Golden Troupe, as Golden Troupe provides an extra 56% damage bonus on her dual scaling main damage source. Husk also relies much more on her burst's damage, so you need to start building into energy recharge, which you pretty much don't want to do. In mono Geo teams, she doesn't need almost any energy recharge because of their insane Geo particle generation. However, in other teams, she'd need about 175%, which just takes way too much from her damage stats. Mono Geo teams also provide about 71% worth of defense, which reduces the effectiveness of the defense percent that Husk grants. Mono Geo teams don't grant much percent damage bonus though, so giving her more in Golden Troupe will be about 15% stronger than Husk will. At the current moment, her constellations are all very strong, with her best being C2, C3, and C4. Her first is also good, but it's only really because it's a pay-to-fix-our character sort of constellation. Its main benefit is it allows her to always summon both dolls with her skill and gain the 20% Geo damage bonus even without a Geo construct. This will not matter for her best teams, but it will allow her to function outside of those teams and work better with units like Navia or Noelle. It also increases the range on her skill, which is a nice consistency boost, though not super important since her range was already pretty long. Her C2 is probably her strongest, as it will end up summoning 3 dolls over the course of a rotation when someone in your party deals normal charged or plunging attack damage after she uses her skill. This damage scales very hard, which is why it's so good, and it will end up putting her over the top in most situations. Her C3 increases her skill's damage which is her main damage source. However, her actual skill talent makes up less than what her Ascension passive and C2 dolls do, so it's not as significant as you'd think. Despite that, it's still very good. Her C4 is slightly worse than her C2, but it's basically the same effect. This time though, it requires that she uses her burst instead of her skill. If she doesn't have enough energy recharge, then this constellation is not in effect, but the raw damage it provides will still almost always be powerful. Her C5 buffs the talents of her burst, which at this point is only being used to activate her C4, or because the animation is very pretty. Despite that though, this is her worst constellation by far. Her C6 is good, but it's not a means to use her as a main DPS as most people think. It pretty much just resets the cooldown on her skill when its main DPS form is used. However, this can only activate once every 15 seconds, so the intent is to have you perform 5 attacks to deal a truckload of damage, then use her skill again for her sub-DPS role. It's a good constellation that'll let you deal a lot of damage up front like Fiorina or Yulan, but you're still going to play her like a sub-DPS. Now with the base kit and stuff done, let's talk about her versus Albedo. These two perform in the exact same role, and there's a lot of people out there that are worried that Chiori is going to just completely beat out Albedo. So let's discuss this. I'm going to throw my calcs for these two up on the screen now using the 3 weapons I mentioned before. If this is too much and seems very confusing, I'll simplify it here. Albedo usually has a higher raw damage output than Chiori, at least until she has her first constellation. Albedo also always beats out Chiori in AoE content because his AoEs are 3 times the size as hers. However, when she does have her extra puppets, she can contend with him a bit better, as she will either be on par with him or surpass him in single target content. I also want to note Albedo's consistency issues, which I'll get more into in a sec, but if Albedo does not hit about 3 flowers, Chiori surpasses him in damage pretty much across the board. There are also a few other differences I want to point out between the two that aren't just damage. One is Chiori's requirement for a Geo Construct user. I want to be clear here that there are some situations where she can surpass Albedo even with just 1 puppet. However, in most cases, Albedo will straight up beat her out. Without this requirement met, this pure sub-DPS unit ends up losing out on a crap ton of damage, and she becomes a straight up bad unit. But Albedo doesn't take as much of a hit, despite still being pretty bad. Another thing I want to note is their energy generation. Albedo generates about 6.7 particles per rotation, while Chiori generates about 6. While this is small and practically means very little, it can impact team comps with longer rotations. Albedo's consistency issue could also mean that he will generate slightly less than Chiori, so that's another thing to note. And there's also their constellations. Chiori's is incredible. She has a lot of very good ones that are worth going for, including one that fixes her issues. However, Albedo's constellations are all laughably bad. His C2 and C3 are the exceptions, but everything else just straight up sucks. With Chiori's being so much better, she ends up being a straight up stronger unit than Albedo once she's at C2. And once she's at C4, her massive raw damage is really enough to make a C6 Albedo's additional damage and utility completely irrelevant. So if you are looking for a vertical investment character, Chiori is much better. To simplify things down a bit and make things a bit easier to digest, I'm going to do a pros and cons section. We'll start with Albedo since he is currently in the game. Albedo, on top of being a sub-DPS unit, is also a support character. While he himself can't make use of his elemental mastery buff, his teammates can, which makes him a good flex unit into Vaporize, Aggravate, Hyperbloom, or other teams like that want the elemental mastery buff. Albedo's AoEs are also incredibly large, as they're about 3 times the size as Chiori's. This makes him significantly better than her in AoE content. On top of that, Albedo's burst has true quadratic scaling, which means in the right situations, he can have one of the hardest hitting bursts in the entire game. But this will only happen like maybe once in 3 years. But this also contributes to him being significantly better in AoE content. However, he comes with a lot of downsides. His damage is pretty much completely unreliable. One of the reasons why is because it can be destroyed for some reason. I still don't really understand why they did that. And you might think that this wouldn't happen a whole lot, but I swear it does. It happens every single boss fight. It's very annoying. His damage also relies on coordinated attack mechanics. So if you have no direct damage, Albedo will deal no damage. This is important specifically for when dealing with elemental shields, like the ones that Abyss Mages, Lectors, and Heralds have. And finally, Albedo's damage has a limited range, so if someone moves out of the circle, he will end up dealing no damage. Albedo has a bunch of other issues, like ruining reactions, because he's Geo, and not being able to benefit from his own elemental mastery buff. And while the former might actually be a good con to put here, him being Geo, I could also put that for Chiori, so I'm not going to put that down. Speaking of, let's talk about Chiori's pros and cons. My most favorite of which is that she can attack elemental shields, like the ones that Abyss Mages, Lectors, and Heralds have, making her pretty much the only off-field character that can reliably contribute to this. This is especially important because Geo gets super walled by these Abyss enemies, but with Chiori, you can worry a lot less about that. She also has some incredible single target damage, as it's some of the highest in the game that really only requires Zhongli to reach that potential. Her long range and automatic attacks means that she's also super convenient because she's a set it and forget it character. However, she does still have her downsides. Her biggest one is that she's reliant on constructs, or Zhongli specifically, which can be incredibly annoying to build a team around. Her AoE damage is also incredibly bad, which is important because the main enemies that are weak to Geo are the Wolfhound pups that come in a bunch of packs. Chiori cannot reliably deal with these enemies, while Albedo can. And on top of that, Chiori offers no utility whatsoever. She's a straight up DPS unit who relies solely on her damage output and nothing else. This, plus a pretty heavy restriction, makes her a relatively niche character, even though she might not initially seem like it. However, I think the most important difference between the two that most people are going to feel is that Chiori's downsides are controlled by the player. If you give her a construct, she's golden, she functions, she works. She slays. Slay Queen. On the other hand, there's Albedo, whose downsides are controlled by the enemies. His kit is immediately turned off if there are elemental shields, or if enemies have large AoEs that can destroy his flower, or if they're just super fast and they end up moving out of his flower's range. If this does happen, he will need to be swapped back on field in order to reposition it, which can ruin rotations. Chiori does not need to do this, which is another reason to pick her up over Albedo. But this also means that Chiori will be much more consistent and significantly less frustrating to play with over Albedo. Albedo is also generally not good enough without Zhongli, which is also where Chiori thrives. This, in my opinion, ends up making Chiori a direct power creep to Albedo, while also being significantly more consistent. If you want to think about it this way, she is the quality of life update that Albedo mains have been wanting for a long time. Personally, I think that this is pretty stupid. I would have loved to see a character that did something for the Geo roster to make the units more viable or make the element more interesting, and it's kind of sad to see a simple sub-DPS unit with nothing other than damage. But Albedo was the only other sub-DPS and most Geo units require on-field time, so I guess it's nice to get a bit of diversity. This is just a quick initial video on Chiori. I will be doing an update on this after the first beta update comes out, so stay tuned for that. But with that out of the way, I have nothing left to say. So what do you all think about Chiori? Tell me your thoughts in the comments down below. But otherwise, I'm going to get out of your hair. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see you all next time. Bye bye!